Among the wailing of wind, crashing of the sea, and cries of scared passengers was the screams of one small baby. This small baby boy looked up into the eyes of none other than his guardian angel, a reverend who would scoop him up and shelter him from the storm. This ocean child would be one of the few survivors of one of the earliest shipwrecks in White Star Line's history. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for our younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Today we get into RMS Tayleur, a full-rigged iron clipper ship that had so much promise, only to meet a disappointing and terrible end. There are some personal stories of victims in here, and the one I will be focusing on in the latter part of this episode is the Ocean Child, so please stay tuned for that. As for RMS Tayleur, it's public knowledge that she was chartered by the White Star Line, infamous for the loss of their ship, RMS Titanic, many years later. However, she was not owned by the White Star Line, instead being owned by Charles Moore & Company. She was designed by William Rennie of Rennie & Johnston, Liverpool, and built at the Charles Taylor Foundry at Warrington, the same Charles Taylor she was named after. He'd been the founder of the Vulcan Engineering Works at Bank Quay, Warrington. She was ordered on February 6, 1853, being laid down in April of that same year. She would cost £50,000 in 1853, and in 2024, that would be £7,961,440. It would take just 6 short months to build her, and during this process, the future captain John Noble toured her shortly before launch and fell into one of the 7 holds, sustaining serious injuries. Keep this in mind, because some assume he got head injuries that would contribute to the sinking later. Tayleur would then be launched on October 4, 1853, being towed down the Mersey River to Liverpool where she was fitted out. Getting her to Liverpool was tricky. She was towed by 3 tugs and had to stop halfway at Runcorn overnight to stem the tide. Her fitting out was also done at lightning speed, though her maiden voyage, planned for November 20, 1853, was delayed because of her large size and moving her to Liverpool. She'd be chartered by White Star Line to serve the booming Australian trade routes, and it was booming especially because of the Australian gold rushes. Before we get further into her story, let's stop and look at her specs. Tayleur was an iron-hulled clipper that displaced 1,750 tons, capable of carrying 4,000 tons of cargo in 7 holds 28 feet deep below 3 decks. She also had a net register tonnage of 2,500 tons. She was 230 feet long, had a beam of 40 feet wide, and a draft of 21 feet. As for passenger capacity, we don't have her exact registered capacity, but on her maiden and final voyage, we have varying numbers on who was on board. Some sources I've found have stated 72 crew and 581 passengers, and another states 627 passengers and 25 crew, and most recent research by Dr. Edward J. Bork cites 662 people on board. Either way, most sources agree there were about 650 people aboard total. Her 3 masts were fully rigged with sails, and this was her main source of propulsion. We don't have any information on her average speed, and this is because she never underwent sea trials, a big no-no. She had many issues that would contribute to her loss, and we have no issues making fun content like this. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Alright, let's look at the issues. Like I briefly mentioned a moment ago, she never underwent sea trials. This wasn't uncommon either in this time period. Merchant mariners at the time sometimes didn't undergo sea trials because of the time restraints, economics, and low crew numbers that didn't always give them the ability to test their ships. The Navy always performed sea trials, but merchant mariners didn't always practice this notion. The ship was readied very quickly after launch, just over 2 months for her maiden voyage, and this would leave little to no time for sea trials. She sat for a week in the Mersey Channel waiting for her crew and passengers, and then she'd set sail. Had there been time for Captain Noble to take her out for trials, he might have noticed some of the other fatal flaws prior to her fateful voyage. Another key issue was the build itself. She was the largest of 11 iron ships built by the Bank Key Foundry during a short-lived program of shipbuilding from 1852 to 1855. Prior to this, the company was known for its heavy castings and ironworking. Rennie, her designer, had just recently developed an interest in iron shipbuilding. Some reports state, quote, "The ship was originally designed as a screw steamer, but whilst on the blocks, its form was changed to that of a clipper, owing to the lack of availability of a suitable engine." One consequence of this modification would be to increase her dimensions, making her enormous for her time. This bulky iron frame would prove difficult for a multitude of reasons. Well, she was iron, and if you didn't know, iron is highly magnetic. Compasses, an important tool in navigation, are also magnetic, and there's a theory that her iron hull played a part in messing with her 3 compasses. Iron has been historically documented to mess with compasses in navigation, so iron from guns and ballasts was often kept far from navigational equipment to mitigate compass deviation. Deviation happens anyway due to the difference in magnetic fields in different parts of the Earth, but it happens far more on ironclad ships than wooden ships. Without sea trials, the deviation in Taylor's compasses was unnoticed until the final voyage, when the 3 compasses were all pointing different directions as she steered out of Mersey into the Irish Sea. It is now understood that ships have 2 kinds of magnetic effect, induced and permanent. In iron ships, the induced magnetism is brought about by the effect of the Earth's magnetic field on the soft iron of the ship. This form of magnetism is altered as the ship changes course or moves to an area of differing magnetic field. The second form, permanent magnetism, is induced by the vibration of hammering and riveting on the ship's metal. It aligns the molecules permanently in a way that is determined by the lie of the ship during the construction, although it can change slowly as the ship voyages. Not only this, but she lacked a masthead compass placed away from the iron hull altogether, meaning all 3 compasses would be negatively affected by the iron in her hull. Let's talk about her rudder. It was dangerously too small for the tonnage of the vessel, so this made turning and tacking quickly almost impossible. If she needed to avoid something, as often ships seem to, she would not be able to turn quick enough to avoid it, and this would prove disastrous in the sinking. Her rigging was yet another thing that could have played a role in her sinking, though the Board of Trade and Coroner's Enquiries make little mention of it. According to Robert Davison, a steerage passenger and seaman of 26 years, he was surprised to find riggers still completing their work the day before the ship was due to sail. He also noted that the natural fiber running rigging ropes had not been properly stretched. They need to be stretched so the rope becomes less elastic as the strands bind together and combine to produce a rope of greater breaking strain. This also reduces the number of frayed rope filaments that can jam pulleys. With all of this neglect to the rigging, the handling of the ship would have been wildly more difficult. Because of the elasticity, setting the ship's sails would be horrific. Captain Noble stated he stood for 14 hours on the same tack despite the fact there was a heavy wind blowing, and this coupled with passenger reports of the crew having difficulty reefing the sails, meaning 3 hours to reef the topsail among the rest, appeared to indicate there was problems with the ship's rigging and handling. Okay, we've laid out all of her cards on the table. Now it is time to look at her first and only voyage. Taylor left Liverpool headed for Melbourne, Australia on January 19, 1854 on her maiden voyage. Again, the number of crew and passengers is debated, but it is somewhere around 654 people aboard. Her 29-year-old master, Captain John Noble, was at the helm, and unfortunately, he would have a difficult time this voyage. During the inquiry, it was determined that of her estimated 25 crew, only 12 were trained seamen, of which 8 could not speak English, so we were off to a poor start. It's been reported in newspaper accounts that many of the crew were seeking free passage to Australia, and most of them would survive what was to come. Like I mentioned earlier, her compasses weren't working properly, at one point being almost 17 degrees off of what it was supposed to be, and this probably was due to the iron hull of the ship. The crew believed they were sailing south through the Irish Sea, but unfortunately, they were heading west straight toward Ireland. Within a short 48 hours of setting off on January 21, 1854, RMS Tayleur found herself surrounded by fog and deep in a storm, with the heavy seas being churned up like splashes in a bathtub. She was also on a course dead set toward the island of Lambay, just off the coast of North County Dublin, Ireland. Because of the faulty rudder making it impossible to tack in the northerly current and the unstretched rigging making it impossible to control the sails, and the slotting effect of the wind in the sails were driving the ship sideways, right toward the island. The crew sighted the rocks off Lambay and almost immediately dropped both of her anchors. However, this did nothing as the chains broke, and Taylor ran aground on the east coast of Lambay Island with a violent lurch and awful grinding sound. They were only 5 miles from Dublin Bay, but couldn't have felt further from safety. Remember, this was also before Marconi wireless telegraphs, so there was almost no way to call for help. The passengers and crew of Taylor were on their own. We also have to note this was during a time where there were fewer lifeboats and lifebelts than needed for a safe evacuation of all passengers and crew, which would contribute to a ravenous need for self-preservation and an intense panic that would cause more casualties. Initially, there were attempts to lower the ship's lifeboats. However, much like we saw in the sinking of SS Atlantic, it would not bode well. The first one was smashed on the rocks, and the second drifted out into the Irish Sea, eventually being recovered in 1856, 2 years later. It was then deemed that launching more lifeboats was unsafe and unnecessary. You might be thinking the same thing I was. Unnecessary? Unnecessary how? Well, she was so close to the shore that the crew were able to collapse a mast onto the shore, and some people were able to jump onto land by climbing on the mast and crawling across. Some who did make it across brought ropes attached to the ship with them, securing them at the shoreline so others could hoist themselves over using them. Captain Noble waited aboard on Taylor until her final moments, then jumping toward shore and being rescued by a passenger. With the storm and heavy seas continuing to batter the ship, it loosened it from its post on the rocks and washed Taylor out into deeper water, and she sank to the bottom with only the tops of her masts and flags showing. A surviving passenger on shore alerted the Coast Guard station on the island, and together with 4 Coast Guards, this passenger launched the Coast Guard galley. Upon reaching the wreck of Taylor, they found the last survivor, shivering and exhausted at the tops of the rigging. His name was William Vivers, and he'd spent 14 hours clinging to safety here. He was then rescued by the Coast Guards, and on March 2nd of 1854, the chief boatman, George Finley, was awarded an RNLI Silver Medal for this rescue. This marked the end for Taylor. And for our YouTube members and patrons, this is only the beginning. This episode couldn't be possible without our amazing YouTube members and patrons. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Okay, let's look at the legal aspects. The newspaper accounts were quick to point fingers at the crew for negligence, though the official coroner's inquest at Malahide absolved Captain Noble, instead putting the blame on Charles Moore and Company, the ship's owners. They were accused of neglect for allowing the ship to depart without her compasses being properly adjusted. However, the Board of Trade under Captain Walker did fault Captain Noble for not taking soundings, which is a standard practice when sailing in low visibility. There were 2 final inquiries, the Admiralty investigation chaired by Mr. Graham, Inspector of Iron Ships, and the Liverpool Maritime Board, which tried the fitness of Captain Noble to command. Among all 4 inquiries, there are wildly different findings and opinions. Since we can't be sure how many people were aboard, we can't be sure how many casualties there were. The estimates on board were somewhere between 528 and 680, and the dead range from 100 to 475, depending upon the sources you consult. What we do know is that out of the over 200 women aboard, only 3 survived, possibly because of the difficulty of the bulky clothing of the Victorian era. One of these women to survive was 26-year-old Mrs. Rosalind Burton, and she lost both of her parents and her husband in the sinking, though her young 6 or 7-year-old son James Burton was one of the only 2 or 3, sources differ, children to survive of the more than 50 aboard. Another child listed as rescued is the Ocean Child, a small boy of about 12 months. This baby was an anonymous child plucked up from the wave-swept deck by an elderly man just before the ship fell into the sea. This man happened to be Reverend John Armstrong, and he placed a description of the infant in newspapers to catch the eyes of any relatives in England. The child was described as, quote, boy about 12 months old, unweaned, fine skin, blue eyes, dark eyelashes, light curly hair, square prominent forehead, 2 lower teeth, without any marks whatever on the body, of a lively affectionate disposition, and has apparently been much petted. supposed to belong to the middle classes. Astonishingly enough, this advertisement worked. Reverend Armstrong fostered the young boy for 4 weeks until his maternal grandmother came to claim him. The boy turned out to be a baby named Arthur Charles, son of Charles Griffith. He also became quite the object of attraction to visitors, being dubbed the Ocean Child and the Orphan of the Wreck Tayleur. In order to get to shelter, the survivors had to crawl over the tipped-over mast or haul themselves over to the shoreline using the ropes fastened there. Then, they looked up at an almost sheer 80-foot cliff they had to climb to get to shelter. It was an uphill battle, and the number of survivors is uncertain. This sinking was covered up largely by the White Star Line and the British government, only to be eclipsed by the sinkings of SS Atlantic and RMS Titanic later on. I do need to get on my soapbox again for this episode, as I've seen this referred to as the Victorian Titanic before and compared heavily to Titanic. It's true, both were RMS ships, both were White Star liners, though from different companies, and both went down on their maiden voyages. It's also true that a variety of reasons contributed to these disasters, like inadequate or faulty equipment. However, the fact of the matter is they are both different disasters and happened for completely different reasons. Comparing them only takes away from both disasters.
Stop it. Get some help.
And it's important to remember all of the victims of both disasters equally. There is a memorial set up for the victims of Tayleur at Portrane, and it was unveiled on May 16, 1999. As for the wreckage of RMS Tayleur, it was rediscovered in 1959 by members of the Irish Sub-Aqua Club. The wreck is 170 years old, so a license to dive the site must be obtained from the Office of Public Works, a major Irish government agency. The wreck lies about 56 feet down, about 100 feet off the southeast corner of Lambay Island, in a small indentation at 53 degrees 28 minutes 54 seconds north and 6 degrees 1 minute 12 seconds west. There's still quite a bit of wreckage remaining, including her iron hull, side plates, a donkey engine, and the lower mast. Shortly after the wreck, her woodwork was salvaged, so you won't see that down there. Crockery and several pieces of the wreck are on display at Newbridge House, Danube. Remember, if you are wanting to dive this wreck, make sure to bring an experienced diver with you and follow all safety recommendations. This disaster was ultimately one of the many nails in the coffin for the first iteration of the White Star Line, a stain on their already checkered past. As for Thomas Ismay's iteration of the company, his first big tragedy would come in the form of SS Atlantic, and both of these wrecks, less than 20 years apart, would take the lives of over 1,000. Rest in peace to all of the victims of RMS Tayleur. May we never forget. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our Ocean Liners playlist in the cards. Next week, we get into the story of San Jose, a Spanish galleon that sank during battle in 1708 off the coast of Colombia, with roughly $17 billion worth of gold, silver, and emeralds aboard. Thank you for tuning into Shipwreck Sunday, have a great week, and we'll see you next time.